All right, guys. So we're going to be looking at the Unit 5 review sheet. Similar to previous units, I have to break these videos up into a couple different sections because the max can be 5 minutes. So there'll be at least three or four of them, but here we go. Number one, during the 1920s, there was a reaction against undesirable immigrants. Describe how the Emergency Quota Act and the two National Origins Acts limited immigrants who were deemed to be undesirable. So basically, these laws set quotas or limits on immigration overall, but specifically, they severely restricted immigration from countries in Southern and Eastern Europe. And essentially, these laws were a reflection of the nativist attitudes of the 1920s. Number two, the KKK rose in membership in the 1920s. Who were its targets? So in the 1920s, the KKK expanded significantly. And aside from just persecuting African Americans, the KKK also went after immigrants, Catholics, Jews, communists, anarchists, and basically acted like a nativist organization. Number three, although the 18th Amendment prohibited alcohol in the U.S., people still chose to violate that law. What does that tell us about laws that try to control people's behavior? Well, essentially, those laws don't work. They're difficult to enforce. And the bottom line is people really don't like the government telling them what to do with their own private lives and their own private behavior. Number four, who are Sacco and Vanzetti, and why are they important to understand the 1920s? So Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrant anarchists that were accused of murder. They were subsequently tried, convicted, and then executed, but there was very, very little actual evidence against them. But the reason we study them is that their conviction with very little evidence kind of demonstrated the nativist anti-immigrant bias that existed not only in society at large, but also specifically in the justice system in the 1920s. It'd be unlikely they would have been convicted with that little evidence had they not been Italian immigrants. Number five, describe the argument between the two sides in the Scopes trial of 1925. So the Scopes trial really exemplifies the cultural conflict of the 1920s between the older, more traditional fundamental way of doing things and the newer kind of scientific viewpoint. So as far as the religious fundamentalist side, that kind of held that the Christian Bible is the literal truth and that should be taught in public schools. And the scientific view, on the other hand, really more favored the modern viewpoint and the scientific viewpoint on things like evolution and stated that should be taught in public schools. Number six, describe the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance was a period of significant African American cultural achievement. Specifically, there was a explosion of poetry and music, especially jazz music, art, and literature that was created by African Americans during this time period. And really, it was focused on the Harlem neighborhood in New York City. It's where a lot of these artists lived and where a lot of the works were created. Number seven, which industrial product of the 1920s affected more jobs, locations of homes, services than any other product? It was the automobile. So this really picks up really after World War II, so later on. But even in the 1920s, with the car being more cheaply mass-produced, more and more people could afford it, which leads to other related industries growing, like auto repair shops and gas stations. It leads people to be able to move out of the cities into the suburbs. So the cultural influence of the automobile was huge. Number eight, how were the flappers of the 20s different from most women in the United States? So the big thing about flappers is they challenged traditional gender roles and gender norms. They did this by cutting their hair short, staying out late, drinking, dancing, smoking, things like that. Number nine, there was also a rise in leisure activities during the 1920s. Some of the leisure activities that grew in popularity were going to baseball games, listening to programs on the radio, going to the movies, going to boxing matches, betting on horse racing, going out dancing. People were able to do these things because industrialization has led to people having more money, having the time to engage in leisure activities.